Welcome to this training session from Aerohive covering wireless security. In this session, we will discuss a security overview, authentication, encryption, and hopefully answer some of the questions you may have about these topics. Layer 2 security overview. First, we have authentication, which is the identity and validation. That could simply be a username, a password, knowing the pre-shared key of a service set, having a certificate. It could be using a key fob. It could be using a card reader, anything that validates who the person is that's logging on. Once the security of the authentication has been passed and you've associated, you have to worry about passing data securely. And that would be the encryption via data privacy, and there are multiple encryption standards as well. Security standards and certification comparisons. We have the Wi-Fi certification, which would be legacy, WPA, WPA2, and wireless protected access and wireless protected access 2 were developed as 802.11i, the security amendment, was undergoing development itself. The industry was clamoring for some type of security, but did not want to wait until 802.11i was ratified. The Wi-Fi Alliance developed 802.11 security under WPA and WPA2 prior to 802.11i being ratified, and the development was simply adopting where 802.11i was in its stage of development at the time. The Wi-Fi Alliance then went back to all the vendors and said, if you want to continue getting your Wi-Fi certifications, you will make all of your devices function to this level of security. Different authentication methods and encryption methods exist with these. With legacy security, you would have open networking or WEP, which would use the RC4 algorithm, and the key generation would be a static key. With WPA, there was initially WPA Radius, which is now WPA Enterprise, and WPA Pre-Shared Key, which is now WPA Personal. The encryption method used with WPA Personal is Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP, which used the same cipher as WEP, the RC4 algorithm, and the keys were then dynamic rather than static. With the original WPA Enterprise will allow you to integrate with Radius for authentication, but the encryption method was still going to be TKIP using the RC4 algorithm. WPA2 introduced WPA2 Personal and WPA2 Enterprise, again pre-shared key or Radius, and both of those methods allow you to use AES encryption, which uses the Reindel algorithm instead of the RC4 algorithm, and it is much more secure than the TKIP encryption method. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Authentication is just validating the credentials, username, passphrase, certificate. Authorization is granting access to network resources. And accounting is keeping track of when those things occurred and the outcome of any negotiations for authentication. Legacy pre-shared key was initially the security we had, pre-shared key or nothing, but using standard pre-shared key these days means that you want to use the same key on every device. By using the same key on every device, it's very easily configured. Everyone has the same key, everyone knows what the key is, but it's also very weak because of those same reasons. Every device has the same pre-shared key, and all of the users know and use the same pre-shared key. If one device is compromised, they're all compromised. If someone leaves the organization and knows your key, that key is considered to be compromised, and it should be changed on every device in the organization, which unfortunately is a very cumbersome task. Another downside of using legacy pre-shared key is everyone shares the same encryption. So if anyone knowing the key would like to, they would have no problem in decoding anyone else's traffic using the same key. Aerohive can provide private pre-shared keys. Private pre-shared keys still allows the ease of setup of pre-shared key without going into an 8021X authentication process, but each user would get a separate key, providing a separate encryption for each user. If one device becomes compromised or a user leaves your organization knowing a key, you just simply remove that key, update the Hive APs, and that key is no longer valid. Removing the key and updating the Hive APs is not completely dissimilar to revoking a certificate and then publishing a new certificate revocation list should you be using certificate-based authentication. However, there are some devices that cannot function with certificates. Maybe they cannot use 8021X, or doing so impedes their roaming, and the manufacturers of those devices will recommend that you go back to using just a pre-shared key. Going back to using just a pre-shared key in a legacy key world would leave you vulnerable to a simple crack that would reveal all the traffic, or someone leaving the organization forcing you to change the key on every single device. By using a pre-shared key that is a private pre-shared key from Aerohive, every device would have its own encryption. Every device would be able to be removed from the security without having to reconfigure every single device on the network using the key, because there's really just one using the key at that point. 8021X is a much more secure method of connectivity, but as you add layers of security, you also add layers of complexity and multiple opportunities where things could go awry. In this diagram, you can see the supplicant, in this case a laptop, sends an 802.11 authentication and association request to the authenticator, the access point. At this point, we're using open authentication and open association, which requires no credentials. You have to be able to connect to the access point to be able to send all of the EAP processes, the Extensible Authentication Protocol processes, through the access point, the authenticator, to the authentication server. Once the open authentication process has completed, the supplicant will send an EAP poll start frame to the authenticator. The authenticator sends an EAP request or an EAP identity request to the supplicant, which would then respond with a username or an EAP response. At this point, that response will be hashed, and everything else that goes along in the EAP process is going to be inside a protected tunnel, so someone sitting on the outside is not going to be able to see it. Once the EAP request response has been sent by the supplicant to the authenticator passes that request to the authentication server, which issues a radius access challenge or an EAP request. The supplicant at that point sends the EAP response that is hashed back through the AP to the authentication server. If the EAP response from the client matches what's expected from the authentication server sends an EAP radius accept or an EAP success frame to the supplicant, which includes the pairwise master key. At that point, access would be granted. Until access is granted, you're dealing with blocked ports. Even though the user or the device has connected to the AP, they've not been allowed fully on the network until this EAP exchange has finished. There are multiple types of extensible authentication protocols. Some require certificates only on the server, some require certificates on the server and the supplicant, and have different numbers of exchanges on the inside here. When using 8021X and extensible authentication protocol, you should always choose the strongest authentication method that the access point and clients both support that will not adversely impede traffic. 802.1x can also be used with an external remote authentication dial-in user service, or RADIUS. The supplicant would open authenticate and open associate with the access point. Then the EAP process would start with 802.1x, except this time the authenticator would send the request to a RADIUS server. The RADIUS server would be the authentication server, and you could integrate that with an external user database such as lightweight directory access protocol, or LDAP, which would be Open Directory or Active Directory. RADIUS can also work with a flat file, or it can work with something from a spreadsheet. In this diagram, you can see that we are using an LDAP server. RADIUS can also be configured to work with a RADIUS proxy. Instead of every access point on a subnet going across a WAN link to the RADIUS server, they would send the request to a RADIUS proxy, then only the proxy would go out to the RADIUS server. That's going to reduce the amount of traffic over the WAN link, and authentication requests can be routed to the correct server based on Kerberos realm after a sign-in for up to 8 realms. The benefits are that there's no need to define every Hive AP as a RADIUS client, and integration into distributed networks where user accounts are stored across multiple databases becomes a lot easier. 802.1x with internal RADIUS. In this scenario, the Hive AP can function as the RADIUS server. So when the client open authenticates and open associates with the Hive AP, then wants to start the authentication process through RADIUS, it happens right on the Hive AP itself. The Hive AP can host a local database of users, or it too can use an external database which could be hosted on an LDAP server using user credential caching. If you enable the caching, a user could come in at 9 o'clock in the morning, connect, and that information will be cached on the access point. If they go to lunch and turn their laptop off, when they come back, rather than having to authenticate across the WAN again and check with LDAP, the RADIUS server, in this case the Hive AP, would have those credentials cached, and that process would be much faster. The length of time that that information is cached is configurable. Wi-Fi encryption. All wireless traffic is at layer 1 and layer 2 of the OSI model. However, it is carrying a payload normally for all data frames from layer 3 through layer 7. There are different methods of encryption. Wired equivalent privacy uses a 24-bit initialization vector. TKIP uses a 48-bit initialization vector. AES, or CCMP, uses the Rindell algorithm, and robust security networks actually require the use of CCMP. So if you were going to comply with current security standards, you would need to be using CCMP for the encryption. If you were using anything else, you would be called a legacy security network and not a robust security network. Dynamic encryption keys. Master encryption keys are a byproduct of the authentication process. When the supplicant is authenticated by the authentication server using 802.1x or using a pre-shared key authentication, it's going to generate a pairwise master key, or a PMK. The PMK is actually a seed key for the four-way handshake process. The four-way handshake dynamically generates the final unique encryption key called the pairwise transient key. Dynamic encryption keys are useful in more secure networks because they're created as the association occurs. Robust secure networks require that any two radios share unique dynamically created unicast encryption keys. TKIP and CCNP are dynamically generated encryption keys. The process to create these dynamic keys is called the four-way handshake. Layer 2, Layer 3, and Layer 4 firewalls. The Layer 2 firewalls are MAC based, and you can filter based on source and destination MAC addresses. MAC enforcement can deny peer-to-peer traffic and limit access to gateway devices. Now, if you're using strictly Layer 2 filtering like this, remember that all of the Layer 2 information is available in clear text. So if somebody wanted to get around a MAC filter, all they would have to do is watch the traffic going by, find devices that are successfully passing data frames, and clone that MAC address onto themselves. A stateful TCP IP firewall at Layer 3 and 4 is going to allow standard 5-tuple rules to block or allow traffic. Things such as from any IP address to any IP address using this service allow or deny. It is better for denial of service attack prevention. Application support for DNS, FTP, and SIP also exists, and you can have policy-based client isolation. So you'll have a unique feature in the market from Aerohive, so that I can use things like returning attributes from Active Directory to apply a specific firewall to certain groups in Active Directory that will allow their traffic onto or not allow their traffic onto specified networks. If you're using something of that nature, there's no need to have everything in separate VLANs if you're controlling everything by separate user firewalls as part of a user profile. However, if you do have separate VLANs, you could include the VLANs as part of the user profile, as well as adding a Layer 2 and Layer 3 and 4 firewall policy. Captive web portals allow users to sign in to your network. They also allow you to display an accepted use policy to limit your vulnerability to being sued if somebody connects and does something inappropriately, or if something happens badly to someone while they're on your network. Your use agreement can say that you are going to be held harmless if they're using the network at their own risk if it's a guest network. If it's an employee-based network, you can still use a captive portal that will have the acceptable electronics use agreement that all of your employees have probably already signed, but have a simple reminder here. The captive web portal can also feature a redirection upon acceptance. Once they are Welcome to this training session from Aerohive covering 802.11n basics. In this session, we're going to cover physical enhancements including multiple input, multiple output or MIMO, spatial multiplexing, maximum radio combining, channel bonding, and transmit beamforming. We're also going to cover MAC enhancements, which include AM PDUs and AM SDUs. MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, uses multipath, whereas single input, single output, or CISO networks created a situation where MIMO will solve problems, but CISO would encounter the problems from the multipath. MIMO systems, as used by 802.11 and 802.11n radios, are not really tied to 802.11n specifically. MIMO can exist outside of 802.11n, but is a requirement for 802.11n. Single input, single output radios would deal with multipath by using antenna diversity to mitigate it. However, both antennas were never used simultaneously. With MIMO, there are multiple radio chains. The multiple radio chains are a combination of radio and antenna, and those radio antenna can be used at the same time to create upfade rather than downfade as a result of the multipath. A MIMO radio is capable of transmitting up to 4 unique data streams within the multiple RF signals. Each data stream is capable of sending up to 72.2 megabits of real raw data. A MIMO radio will transmit multiple signals within different modulated data via each transmit antenna. In legacy 802.11 environments, multipath truly caused problems. It was mitigated by using antenna diversity. In MIMO, a signal that is reflected will arrive slightly out of sequence with the main beam signal, just like in CISO, except in MIMO, the reflected signal or multipath is going to be used to increase the signal by causing upfade rather than downfade because of the use of the multiple antenna chains. In a typical indoor environment, multiple RF signals sent by a MIMO radio are going to take multiple paths to reach the MIMO receivers due to reflection from desktops and walls and filing cabinets and elevator shafts. For example, multiple copies of 3 original signals can be transmitted by multiple antennas. The MIMO receiver will then use advanced digital processing to sort out the originally transmitted signals. A high multipath environment actually helps a MIMO receiver differentiate between the unique data streams carried on the multiple RF signals. If multiple signals are sent by a MIMO transmitter, all arrive simultaneously at the receiver. The signals will cancel each other out, and performance is basically the same as a non-MIMO system. But arriving at different times, you can use the difference between the signals to differentiate which signal was transmitted from which radio. The receiving device, when it acknowledges the frame, can then tell the transmitting device how to time the signals from each radio so that the signals arrive in phase with each other, creating upphase on the next transmission. Radio chains. Conventional 802.11 radios transmit and receive RF signals by using just a single input, single output system. Single input, single output systems use a single radio chain. A radio chain is defined by a single radio and all of its supporting architecture, including any amplifiers or any type of attenuators or connectors, any kind of converters, anything that is part of that system would be considered part of the CISO system. A MIMO system consists of multiple radio chains, each with a radio chain having its own antenna. A MIMO system is also characterized by the number of transmitters and receivers used by the multiple radio chains. For example, a 2x3 MIMO system would consist of 3 radio chains with 2 transmitters and 3 receivers. A 3x3 MIMO system would use 3 radio chains with 3 transmitters and 3 receivers. In a MIMO system, the first number always references the transmitters, the second number represents the receivers, and if there's a third number, such as 3x3x3 MIMO, the third number represents the number of data streams. Spatial multiplexing. Within the multiple transmissions is independent unique data stream. Each independent data stream is known as a spatial stream, and each unique stream can contain different data than the other streams. Each stream will also travel in a different path because there is at least a half wavelength of space between the multiple transmitting antennas. The fact that the multiple streams follow different paths to the receiver is because of the space between the transmitting antennas, known as spatial diversity. When sending multiple independent streams of unique data using spatial diversity, it is also often referred to as a spatial multiplexing or spatial diversity multiplexing system, which is used by 802.11n. Spatial multiplexing has several benefits. The benefit of transmitting this way, the largest benefit, is the unique data streams that are pushed through are drastically increasing the throughput. If a MIMO access point sends 2 unique data streams to a MIMO client station that receives both streams, the throughput is effectively doubled. If a MIMO access point sends 3 unique data streams to a MIMO client station that receives all 3 streams, the throughput is effectively tripled. It is possible to have an access point that supports 3x3x3 MIMO, but maybe there's a client connecting, such as a phone, that only supports 1x1x1. If that is the case, the access point can step down to communicate with the less efficient client. Radio chains and spatial streams. A 2x3 MIMO system would consist of 3 radio chains with 2 transmitters and 3 receivers. A 3x3 MIMO system will consist of 3 radio chains with 3 transmitters and 3 receivers. In a MIMO system, the first number always references the transmitters, the second number references the receivers, and the third number references the spatial streams. Please don't confuse the independent unique streams of data with the number of transmitters. In fact, when referring to MIMO radios, it is important to also reference how many unique streams of data are sent and received by the MIMO radios. Most Wi-Fi vendors, using a 3-number syntax when describing MIMO radio capabilities, are going to show you 3x3 or 2x3 and a third number separated by a colon to represent the number of spatial streams. In a MIMO system, the first number always is the transmitter, the second number is always the receiver, and again the third number represents how many unique streams of data can be sent or received. For example, 3x3x2 would use 3 transmitters and 3 receivers, however only 2 unique data streams are ever utilized. Another example of 3x3x3 would mean that there are 3 transmit, 3 receive, and 3 spatial streams. MIMO diversity. MIMO diversity uses maximal ratio combining, uses algorithms to join multiple received signals, and is going to function much better indoors than outdoors. The reason this functions better indoors than outdoors is because indoors there are more reflections that the MIMO diversity can be used for to determine the different signal streams and create upfade. When using this outdoors, there are not as many surfaces to reflect off of, so there are not as many reflections for MIMO to use to improve the signal strength. Antenna diversity. Antenna diversity is simply a method of mitigating the effects of multipath as opposed to utilizing multipath. Legacy 802.11n radios, such as pre-N or maybe legacy ABG radios, use single input, single output, and would use two antennae connected to one radio. However, unlike a MIMO chain, the two antennae could not be used at the same time, and the antenna on the receiving device would be the antenna that picks up the stronger signal strength being used. The weaker signal being picked up by the second antenna would be ignored. When that device responded by sending an acknowledgement, it would transmit back out the antenna that received the signal strength greater than the other, because that antenna would be more likely to transmit back to the client that they're trying to get to in a stronger manner. Receive diversity versus transmit diversity. When I'm receiving, I have the ability to transmit data from one client to another, and the receiving client will decide which antenna is going to be used for the reception based on signal strength. When I transmit, I'm going to transmit back out that same antenna. 802.11n devices are using methods that create upfade, such as maximum ratio combining, space-time block coding, and cyclic shift diversity. Maximal ratio combining. Without maximal ratio combining, one signal sent is only going to be received through one antenna. This is the case for a single input, single output environment using simple antenna diversity. By using maximal ratio combining, one or more signals can be sent. All signals are going to be received and combined at the receiver, increasing the fidelity of the signal. The receiver also has multiple radio chains. When receive diversity is used, the antenna may also be linearly combined by using a signal processing technique which we call maximal ratio combining. Algorithms are used to combine multiple received signals by looking at each unique signal and optimally combining the signals in a method that is additive rather than destructive as in CISO. MIMO systems using both switch diversity and maximal ratio combining together will effectively raise the signal to noise level of the received signal. Maximal ratio combining is most useful when a non-MIMO radio transmits to a MIMO receiver and multipath occurs. The maximal ratio combining algorithm focuses on the signal with the highest signal to noise ratio level. However, it may still combine information from the noisier signals. The end result is that you have less data corruption occurring because a better estimate of the original signal has been reconstructed by comparing the stronger signal with some of the weaker signals that are received. Space-time block coding. Space-time block coding is simply a method where the same information is transmitted on two or more antennas. It is a type of transmit diversity. By sending multiple copies of the same signal on multiple antennas, the actual rate of the data transmitted does not increase as you add more antennas. The rate does, however, increase the receiver's ability to detect signals at a lower signal-to-noise ratio than would otherwise have been possible. The receive sensitivity of the radio system improves. Space-time block coding and cyclic shift diversity are transmit diversity techniques where the same transmit data is sent out of multiple antennas. Space-time block coding communication is possible only between 802.11n devices. Cyclic shift diversity signals can be received by either 802.11n capable devices or by legacy 802.11 devices. Channel bonding. With 40 megahertz versus 20 megahertz channels, you're going to get a much greater throughput. By using channel bonding with 802.11n, data frames are sent on 40 megahertz wide channels, and the unbonded channels, the 20 megahertz channels, will be reserved for management frames. Maximizing throughput in 2.4 may mean that you do not want to bond channels. In 2.4 gigahertz, the channels overlap with each other. If I were going to bond channels in 2.4, I would have to bond non-overlapping channels, so I might possibly bond channel 1 and channel 6, which could mean that I'm only able to co-locate one access point using channel bonding in a physical area, because there would only be one single 20 megahertz channel left over, and I would not be able to bond that with anything else. In 2.4, you can maximize throughput actually by not channel bonding and co-locating more APs in the same area, breaking up the contention domain. Bonding in 5 gigahertz actually lets you create a situation where you're using non-overlapping channels, and I can get 40 megahertz wide channels. By using the 4 channels in Uni 1 as depicted in this image, you can bond channels 36 and 40 and 40 and 48 together, so I could put 2 APs in the same airspace using channel bonding. If I were in the upper uniband, I could also add 2 APs. By using both the upper and lower unibands, I have the ability to put 4 access points in the same area that are using channel bonding. If you're in a high density environment, you may elect to do the same thinking as in 2.4 and not bond in order to break up the collision domains, resulting in the ability to co-locate 8 access points instead of co-locating only 4. Here's an example of channel bonding in 5 gigahertz versus channel bonding in 2.4. The top illustration is bonding the channels in the lower uniband. The bottom example is bonding in 2.4's ISM bands. Notice that if you bond in 2.4, you really can only put one access point there because you're taking up almost all of the 2.4 space and you only have one single channel left. Legacy signaling. 802.11n introduced transmit beamforming as part of its requirements. Transmit beamforming allows the receiving client to help the transmitter communicate better with it the next time it sends a signal. Without transmit beamforming, reflections are going to continue to cause problems. Even with antenna diversity, you may have signals arriving out of phase and have problems because of the delay spread between the signals. You're not able to communicate back to the client anything, saying, hey, next time you transmit to me, transmit your radios closer together or farther apart in terms of when they transmit, and you're going to wind up with the same problem we've always had, requiring some type of mitigation. With 802.11n using transmit beamforming, it uses phase adjustment. Transmit beamforming can be used when there are more transmitting antennas than there are spatial data streams. This beamforming is a method that allows a MIMO transmitter using multiple antennas to adjust the phase of the outgoing transmissions in a coordinated method. When multiple copies of the same signal are sent to a receiver, the signals will usually arrive out of phase with each other. If the transmitter knows about the receiver's location, the phase of the multiple signals sent by a MIMO transmitter can be adjusted. When the multiple signals arrive at the receiver, they are now in phase with each other, resulting in constructive multipath, creating upfade rather than creating downfade and a degradation of the signal. Carefully controlling the phase of the signals transmitted from multiple antennas has the effect of emulating a high-gain unidirectional antenna. Because transmit beamforming results in constructive multipath communications, the result is a higher signal-to-noise ratio and a greater received signal strength or amplitude. Therefore, transmit beamforming will result in greater range for individual clients communicating with an access point. Transmit beamforming will also result in higher throughput because of the higher signal-to-noise ratio that allows for the use of more complex modulation methods that can encode more data bits. The higher the signal-to-noise ratio also results in fewer layer 2 retransmissions due to collisions with noise. Frame aggregation. 802.11n also introduces methods of frame aggregation, which is a method of combining multiple frames into a single frame transmission. The fixed MAC layer overhead is going to be reduced because I don't have to transmit multiple frames to get the same volume of data through. The odds of collision are lower because I'm transmitting fewer frames, and the overhead caused by a random backoff timer during any type of medium contention will also be minimized because I'm not transmitting as many frames. Much like driving in a carpool reduces the amount of traffic on the road. Frame aggregation. An aggregate MAC service data unit, or aggregate MSDU, is part of how 802.11n works. 802.11n access point using an AMSDU aggregation will receive multiple 802.11n frames. Remove any kind of weird headers from 802.3 and any trailers, and instead of having separate headers and trailers from the 802.3 frame that's passed down for transmission wirelessly, it's going to wrap the multiple MSDU payloads into a single 802.11 frame for transmission. The aggregated MSDUs will have a single destination when wrapped together in a single frame. The entire frame can then be encrypted using either TKIP or CCMP, and if you want to get the higher data rates using 802.11n, you will need to be using CCMP. It is important to note that the individual MSDUs must all be of the same 802.11e quality of service category. You cannot mix voice and data or best effort together. They all must be of the same category in order for this aggregation to work. Aggregating a MAC protocol data unit. Remember, the MAC protocol data unit is an entire 802.11 frame, including the MAC header, the body, and the trailer. Individual MPDUs within an AMPDU must all have the same receiver address. Also, the data payload of each MPDU is encrypted separately by using either TKIP or CCMP. Very much like an MSDU aggregation, individual MPDUs must all be of the same 802.11e quality of service access category. Again, you cannot mix voice and data or best effort and data. Everything's got to be of the same type in order to be aggregated. MPDU aggregation has more overhead than MSDU aggregation because each MPDU has an individual MAC header and trailer. However, cyclical redundancy check errors can be detected in the individual MPDU frames, and therefore an entire MPDU does not need to be retransmitted. Only the individual MPDU that is corrupted along the way would need to be transmitted. Therefore, when using aggregate MPDUs, you have a situation where you are less susceptible to noise than an MSDU. the majority of vendors use aggregate MPDUs in current equipment available in the market today. Just like we can bind together the data for transmission, you can also bind together the acknowledgments. In this case, it would be called block acknowledgments. An 802.11 unicast frame has to be followed by an acknowledgment for verification purposes because you cannot detect wireless collisions. Multicast and broadcast frames do not have to be acknowledged. An MSDU contains multiple aggregations when using this type of transmission. Every MSDU is all wrapped together in a single frame with only one MAC header and only one destination. Therefore, only normal acknowledgments are required when using MSDU aggregation. However, an aggregate MPDU contains multiple MPDUs, each with their own unique MAC header, just like we previously discussed, so that if one piece of it becomes corrupt, you only have to transmit that one piece again. However, each of the MPDUs in this case must be acknowledged separately. This can be accomplished by using block acknowledgments. It's called a multiple traffic ID block acknowledgement, or MTBA frame. An MTBA frame is essentially a block ACK frame for an AMPDU. Using a single acknowledgement for multiple frame aggregations reduces the overhead at layer 2 and improves throughput because each piece is going to be acknowledged as a part of a block acknowledgement, just like each piece was transmitted as part of a block transmission. That reduces contention and reduces the amount of time any one piece of traffic has to be in the air. Some notes about block acknowledgments. Block acknowledgments are used as lists of data frames being acknowledged. Block acknowledgments provide a more efficient means of frame acknowledgement, and block acknowledgments allow selective retransmission of data frames if needed. Backhaul speeds. 802.11n really changed the game for Wi-Fi. The bottleneck has traditionally been thought of as the speed of Wi-Fi on the network because you could plug in and get a 100 megabit Ethernet connection. Why in the world would I want to use Wi-Fi and only get a 54 megabit data rate, resulting about an 18.5 or 20 megabit throughput? With 802.11n's more efficient modulation techniques and MIMO and channel bonding, you can get data rates theoretically of up to 600 megabits. Practically, with today's hardware, you're going to get data rates of somewhere around 200 megabits as the throughput. In this case, standard Ethernet is the bottleneck, not the Wi-Fi. So when deploying 802.11n, one might find themselves replacing cable and switches on the infrastructure side in order to support the wireless devices. Some common devices you'll find in the market today using 802.11n include phones and laptops and tablets, and here are some popular ones from Apple. The phones are still 1x1x1 MIMO, as are the iPads. That's to save battery life in the device using single radio chains. Phones are still 2.4 gigahertz to be backwards compatible with most networks and to save battery life, whereas the iPads can do both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz from the iPad 2 and up. MacBooks can be of a newer variety or a legacy MacBook. Older MacBooks use 3x3x2 MIMO and use 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Newer MacBooks use 3x3x3 MIMO and can do 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. Some devices, not inside Apple specifically, but some devices may support multiple spatial and data streams like this, but they may not support channel bonding. If you look to the right of this chart, you'll see even from the single vendor, some of the devices support channel bonding and some do not. So there is no guarantee that even if the access point supports every feature that's possible in N to the maximum of that feature's capability, that there will be clients in the next network that can support that as well. When deploying Wi-Fi, always remember that you are deploying to support the clients, not to support every feature that can be turned on in the access point. Thank you for viewing this session from Aerohive covering 802.11n basics. Please continue the rest of the series at your earliest convenience.